Yeah, tell me more about Vaco and Vancouvering.
Yeah, specifically some of his extra Moog activities, when he left the company I had a checkered career myself. I was fired twice and quit 3 times. Never by Bob, but, the owners and so forth. And Dave was heir to the same problems, within the organization. So he did various and sundry other things. He developed an instrument called the Vaco Orchestron. It was forward-looking to the extent that it was about real sounds, what I called a real sound instrument. A lot of people in the industry thought that we would electronically manipulate pulse waves, Walsh functions maybe, or something, have some kind of a design where electronically we would produce realistic sounding instruments. I mean, I think that's done now with physical modeling. It was too far into the future. I saw quite clearly that sampling, a la the Mellotron, but in a digital version, was going to happen. I think Dave did too. Dave didn't have all that much amount of technical acumen, so he really couldn't assess always, whether the technology fit the dream. He was correct in the dream because the Orchestron, it was based on a Mattel Optigun, had real world instruments on these photoelectric discs, these plastic discs, and the waveform engraved on there. Well, that wasn't his idea. It wasn't Mattel's idea. The idea of discs that had, engraved or this or that, the Compton Electron, the Welty organ, there's all kinds of instruments that did it that way. The super piano back to 1925 by Emmerich Spielmann in Austria. There's just all kinds of rotating tone wheels. The Hammond organ, it just happens to have around the periphery of the wheel a sine wave. It could have been another wave. Well, there's an inherent problem with that technology. 12-tone music, equal tempered music, is the 12th root of 2, which is 1 point, in some fractional situation there. And bottom line is, as you go around the periphery of a wheel, if you don't meet, you've got a phase discontinuity. If you don't meet smoothly, now this is done away with modern samplers through, digitally fading interpolating, it's called, between one space and another on the file, the waveform. But back then, when Vaco did the Orchestron, well, you couldn't do that. Now, I had learned from Alan Douglas, who had written a book, several books, that what the problem was. And there was a man named Dorff in the United States who articulated essentially the same thing. So what was your recourse? Well, your recourse in that design is to have 12 wheels, because now you can make the wheel any size you want, and you can have octaves of the same note such that the waveform doesn't meet and all of a sudden have a discontinuity. Click, like that. Well, you can't have 12 discs in a viable musical instrument that every time you want to change the timbre or something, you got to change 12 discs, So Vaco put all the notes on one disc. Not he, actually Mattel. But for Mattel, it was like a kid's toy or something, and Dave tried to elevate it to the status of a serious instrument. And of course, as it went around, you'd be playing this reasonably noisy string sound, and all of a sudden it'd go click or clunk, like that. And it just had too many technical problems to be viable. And I remember seeing that instrument in Florida where Dave was living, and I'd come down there and he had to show me, here's what I'm doing. And I told him about the discontinuity problem and so forth. But, when David got into the mode of the fever of believing in whatever he was going to do, then that was that. And he had signed up all kinds of doctors and dentists to put in $2,000 a piece in what's it called, a limited partnership. So he raised a good bit of money to do this thing, which I might add, Ray Kurzweil raised a lot of money for the Kurzweil, which essentially failed. So, Vaco is not unique in having this experience. But at any rate, the instrument had a deserved death. It had other problems. It was hard to keep mechanical stuff together, and I kept telling people, look, I mean, there are these ways of digitizing sound, and this is the way it's going to go, which interestingly, Bob remembered that I'd made that prediction in a Keyboard Magazine article of some years ago, because the rest of the industry just wasn't hearing that. They were, no, we've got synthesizers. They're going to be electronic. Even as late as, dates. Well, I won't worry about the date. We had actually Charlie Winterbull and some people that had done the SID chip for the Commodore 64 computer come with a digitizing sound system, a digital sound system to the Moog company. Well, I must tell you, the Moog engineers poo-pooed it. Oh, it's only 8 bits. It's noisy. It's this, it's that. I said, it's exactly what the customer wants. Precisely what the customer wants. That then became, and again, I'm having a senior moment. I can't remember the name of the company.
Ensoniq?
It became Ensoniq. That development became Ensoniq and became a $10 million company selling their lousy little 8-bit sampler, which was in the mix of the noise of a musical performance and a mix in a studio. Who cared about the noise? It sounded better than so many other things that were available. At the time, I was somewhat involved and I tried to prevail. I said, no, that's it. Let's go with those guys. They've got something. We could develop that. No. At one point, Norlin actually owned an 18-month option on Synclavier. Yeah. And gave it up, didn't develop it. It was all the way back when John Appleton and Sid Alonso and Cameron Jones were the principals at Dartmouth. And Jim Whitehill and Bill Challoner and I went up and did a negotiation with them and came back within a few weeks with this 18-month option to have that technology. Now, that company failed, of course, but the real question is would they have failed if the money that Norlin had gotten behind it and, made smaller versions and done what you could have done? It's interesting to note that Synclavier are still used at Glen Sound and are still used by the dean of my division who does film scores, Stephen Crows. People that have them don't want to give them up, which says a lot about, again, my viewpoint. You got something that works, you don't get rid of it. If it works, don't replace it. Hollywood is pretty much this way, as a matter of fact. They're going to use whatever technology they're going to do. I mean, that they've proven works. They don't care if you can do Foley, footsteps, and noises, digitally or anything like that. They've got Foley artists that come in one afternoon and do Foley for an entire 10 minutes of film or something,
So are there still lots of Foley artists?
In it's
Hollywood?
Still done the old-fashioned way.
Yeah.
The idea that, we can do that with digital sound effects and so forth. Why do that? You can stand there with a leather jacket and make it creak so that when Darth Vader comes in, there's some sound to acknowledge that somebody's there, which we have to have, of course, in film. We need to have a sound for basically everything we see.
Yeah.
And you can do that real time, and you can do it in sync. And it doesn't really matter if it's in sync. What you learn after looking at this stuff a little bit, you realize hardly anything's in sync. The dialogue's not in sync. It's all done post, after the filming. And you try to get a good sync, but if you don't, people are watching the movie. They're watching the art object. They're not critics. They're not standing there picking it apart. They're there to enjoy something. And they do. They suspend disbelief.
But there must be a maximum shift where people do notice.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's pretty well known from a psychoacoustic standpoint of what we can tolerate. But I think most of the people that do that kind of work, I don't think they've read those papers in psychoacoustics. They simply know when it feels good and when it looks in sync enough, and therefore they work until they get that standard. The whole idea of the specificity of electroacoustic music just turns me off because my soul is that of an artist. I mean, it's like, no, it's gestural and it's emotional, it's feeling, it's expressive, it's not just thinking. Thinking is a part of emotions, but that whole idea that, well, I can, do things to the nth degree and have rise times that are within 53 milliseconds. So who cares in the final analysis? Certainly not the audience. And we prove this over and over and over. Or even, for instance, the idea of what is good sound. The audience doesn't care. Cassettes in the United States outsold LPs, vinyl records. Why? You could take a cassette down to the beach. You could have it in your car. That was more important than whether or not it was a Sheffield 200 ounce or, inscribed at half speed and so forth. It just didn't matter. And again, that idea of, well, there's this technology, there's this artistry, there's this industry. If you don't get all three of those kind of aligned in some reasonable sort of way, you're just not in business. And this has happened to many inventors because they're not in business. They don't want to align. They don't care about some element of that. Vaco cared about the industry, he cared about the artistry, the Orchestron, but he didn't care about the technology enough. That was incidental. It's like, oh, well, somebody has to do that. And he did improve it, by the way. He did improve the Optigan greatly, but, excuse me, it's like polishing a turd. It wasn't going to help that much. It was destined to failure. So it did. And there were people that got pretty angry along the way. Patrick Moraz, I think, was pretty upset. He had gone on record as being a big Orchestron artist, and he did some stuff I thought that was pretty good. Keith Emerson, for Pete's sakes, had done Nighthawks, the score to that, using the Fairlight, which was a terrible 8-bit machine with linear envelopes and all kinds of technical problems. And yet, he did art with it. So again, to me, it all depends on, well, were you successful in one dimension or the other? You could have some crap music, but if it sells 100,000 copies, well, I have to at least bow to that success. It doesn't mean I want to listen to it, but I have to bow to that. Or if it's completely artistic and doesn't sell at all, I can appreciate that. Or if it's a technological marvel that was simply years ahead of its time, I can certainly appreciate that. But if you're going to be in business, you better be thinking about all three of those ideas.